Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Healing Art After Hours. I'm Shauna Robeson with Creating Space Coastal, and in this video, I'm going to try to demystify acrylic painting. We're going to talk about brushes, paints, palettes, some tips and tools and ideas to help get you started and hopefully not overwhelm you with all the options that are out there, but just give you an idea of what to do with what you have or what you might need for what you want to try. Hopefully that didn't make it sound more confusing. That's not my goal, but if you're interested in learning more, let's get started. Let's go. Tonight, we're going to talk about acrylics, and there's so much about acrylics because it is an amazing medium that can do so much that I will never be able to, in an entire month, cover all of the things that it can do. But I want to give you enough information so that you're not overwhelmed when you're out there looking to get supplies. I'm hoping that I can give you enough information to allow you to decide which supplies are the best ones for you and to just see if you're interested in exploring this medium. Like I said, there's a lot of possibilities with it, and we're going to touch some of those this month. I do want to just briefly talk about the differences between watercolor versus acrylic, because I know a lot of people get confused with those two. And since I just finished doing a whole month of watercolors, I thought it would be good to just kind of transition to acrylics by giving you some of the high points. So watercolor is basically pigment, which is a powdered mineral or could be synthetic that's mixed with a gum arabic binder, which is a water-soluble binder. And so that way, when you add water, it dissolves that binder, and then you just get pigment, and it can go on the watercolor paper. You can use it on watercolor paper, but it never becomes permanent. Now, acrylic is also a water-based medium. It is an acrylic polymer binder that's in an emulsion with water. So you can dilute it with water to some extent, and I'll be talking more about that later. And you can wash it with water as long as you get it while it is wet, because what happens is once it dries, it becomes permanent. So that's the difference between watercolor and acrylics as far as how the paint behaves. And that's really important to understand, because that's gonna impact how you work with this medium. You can get a watercolor effect with acrylics. It doesn't act completely the same, but you can use it like you use watercolor. But you have to remember that feature that once it's dry, and you're not going to be able to get it to do anything else. Watercolor is pretty much suitable for watercolor paper, or you have to add an absorbent ground to a surface in order to use it on something other than watercolor paper. Whereas acrylics, you can pretty much put it on just about anything. There are some additives you need to add to make it adhere a little bit better to certain surfaces like glass and things like that. But for the most part, it can go on just about anything. So it's very flexible when it comes to that. Watercolor is translucent and it dries flat. It doesn't have any kind of sheen to it. Whereas, and then now gouache is a watercolor that is creamy, that is not translucent. So that is a watercolor, but it's called gouache, and that is more like pastels, and it's very chalky, and it is opaque. Now, there are some opacities to some watercolors, but for the most part, it is a transparent or translucent medium. And acrylics, the same thing. There is a range of opacity. There are some that are more transparent than others, depending on the specific pigment and also the consistency or which formula that you are getting. But for the most part, they are more opaque, and you can paint one on top of the other and get to the point where you don't see what's underneath. And that's not true typically of watercolor. So you have to treat them differently and plan out your painting differently as a result of that. Watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it is when it's wet on the page, whereas acrylics tend to dry darker than what they look like on the page. So you also need to keep that in mind when you're mixing your colors. If you want it to be darker, you might make it darker, but then it's too dark once it dries. So just be aware of that. And at watercolor, we tend to work from light to dark, because the lightest values, we use the paper that's transparent, because that's a transparent medium. We use the white of the paper as white rather than typically using a white paint. Whereas with acrylics, we work typically from medium values to light and dark, like the lightest and darkest values, so that you can do the highlights and low lights at the end, because since it's opaque, you can do it right on top of it. So it doesn't matter when you put those whites in, because you're not using the white of the canvas typically. So those are the two, just some key differences between watercolor and acrylics. I haven't worked with oils. There are some similarities and differences between oils as well, but I'm not knowledgeable and I didn't want to confuse you by trying to tell you much about that. I just know very little about those differences. Now, acrylic paints, like I said, it's highly versatile. It's made up of a natural or synthetic pigment, which is basically a powder suspended in water and acrylic polymer emulsion. So it's a mix of those two. It can mimic other mediums like watercolor, gouache, and oils. There's actually a gouache acrylic as well, but it can look like a gouache watercolor, but that's permanent. And it also can mimic oils in the blendability and whatnot. It adheres to almost any surface. Like I mentioned, there's a wide range of colors, consistencies, and finishes that you can find in acrylics. The properties can be altered. So even if you have one type of paint, but you want it to do something else, you can add a medium additive, an acrylic additive, that will change the properties of that paint so that you can get more flexibility with that one tube of color. You don't have to buy a different paint necessarily for every property that you want to make. You just have to have the medium that can change the property. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And it can be used in a variety of art and craft techniques. So we'll talk more details about that as well. It dries very quickly, which is a double-edged sword. It's really great compared to an oil because there's a lot of waiting time, but it also means that it can dry too quickly and can reduce the blendability. However, there are additives, like I mentioned, that can extend the drying time and allow you to blend better. So while that can be a challenge, it can be addressed. It also is something to think about when we're talking about the brushes and caring for your palette, caring for your brushes, etc. And I'll talk more about those as well. It is water-based, meaning that it can be diluted or thinned with water, but only up to 25%. And this is something that oftentimes people don't know. And this may be even less if you're using a craft type paint, which has a higher water content to begin with. But basically, since it's about a chemical reaction, because what happens is when that water evaporates, those molecules that are suspended in the water, they start to get closer together. And when they get close together, they stick, kind of like Legos, and they bond and they create that plastic acrylic film. And that's the magic of the acrylic medium. And that's why it's so durable. But if you dilute it too much, you spread out those molecules, they're not going to get together. And so they might not stick. And then what happens is you get cracking or lifting or peeling in your work because it's not holding on to those chemical properties that keeps it durable. So that's why you got to be careful if you want to thin it with water. Now, you can thin it with a medium and get the same effect as you would with water. So if you want it really, really thin and you have a really thick paint, you could just add a thinning medium and there's no problem. It's not going to change the color of your paint, and it's not going to change the chemical bond properties or the durability of your paint or the archival quality of your paint. And that's going to keep it more secure. And like I said, because some of the craft paints have a higher water content, you probably have to be even more careful adding more water because they're already probably just not going to, it's probably already going to be a little bit diluted. So just be aware of that. It is washable with water as long as it's wet. Once it's dry, it's no longer washable with water. Now there are ways to get it off of things that are smooth surfaces, like peeling it up and things like that, but it's just a little trickier once it dries. So it's better to keep things from drying where you don't want the paint to dry out. It also means that you should put some kind of wear an apron or some kind of protective clothing, something that you don't care if you get some of the paint on, because by the time you realize it, it's going to be already on your clothes and hard to get out. So just be aware of that. Once it's dry, it is permanent, and it has a wide range of quality to fit whatever budget you have. So there's the artist quality, and like I talked about, Liquitex, one of the frontiers of the water soluble acrylics. Golden is a great, I also have some golden, and they have some different formulas too within the different companies. I've not used the Winsor Newton, but Winsor Newton does have an acrylic line, I understand. There's also student levels. Liquitex has one called Basics, and then Artist Loft is one, Blick Studio. So you can find the student quality, and then the craft quality is sort of the, you know, that can range even within itself. There's a high range of quality within the crafts. You can find acrylic paints at the dollar store. Now, some of those, what makes a higher quality versus a lower quality paint is basically the amount of the pigment. So you're going to get a higher concentration of the pigment in the higher quality paints. So per the amount of paint that you have, oftentimes you get a heavy body that's really concentrated. It's going to have a lot of pigment in that little bit of paint. And it's also going to be a higher quality pigment. You might get more single pigments. Once you start mixing the pigments up to try to assimilate a color, that can add complications when mixing. So the more pure the paint is as far as pigments go, the more pure you're going to get in your mixes, because you're not trying to mix, you know, these two colors that have mixed to make this. Now you've got 6 colors you're trying to blend together, and they may not play nicely on the mixing playground, so to speak. So the purer the paint, the single pigments are the most pure, and you're going to find those more in the professional quality. And I'll talk a little bit about reading the labels when I'm showing you some of my supplies. And this is very similar to the watercolors, because the pigments are basically the same pigments. They're just mixed in a different emulsion. And there's the same pigment index you can look at to find out, you know, the chemical makeup of that pigment. So just be aware. I'll like I said, I'll show you on the label what is helpful to know. You don't need to know all of that, but it's helpful the more complex you get with colors, and especially if you're going to be doing mixing. Now, with the lower quality paints, they don't mix as nicely usually, or I won't say usually, I'll say oftentimes you might get more muddiness when you try mixing, or you just don't get the color that you expect based on what colors you're looking at. But the great thing about craft paints is that there's a gazillion color choices out there. You oftentimes can find whatever color you're looking for and don't have to mix it all to get what you want. You can just find it right on the shelf, ready to go. And so you're going to probably get more color choices in maybe some of the craft lines because of that. Than you might get in the artist lines, but the artist lines are designed to be doing more mixing. And there's a wide range in there as well. So, but that's the difference between the two. It's just they might use a lower quality pigment, or you might get a diluted amount of pigment, more fillers, more binders. Sometimes those might be chalkier and just not as true to color as some other quality paints. So just being aware of that. Acrylics are easy to mix and blend. And of course, like I talked about, some of the challenges with that is how quickly it dries, but you can remedy that through using either a little bit of water to keep it moist, or also adding a blending or a drying retardant medium to your paints to help reduce the drying time, or to increase the drying time, not reduce the drying time, increase the drying time. And compared to some of the older oil paints, although I think some of the new oil paints are very low odor as well, but they are low odor compared to that. And you don't need all of the chemicals for cleanup. So that's a really nice thing. You don't have to smell the turpentine and those chemicals. I know that oil has come a long way too. So I think that there's a lot of alternatives that don't require that for other things as well, but still it's a bonus. All right. There are many formulas even within the pigmented mediums. So the pigmented paints. There's High Flow as a golden brand. So really, there's really thin, so real watery paints. There's ink. There's acrylic inks. There's fluid, which is which is maybe like a step down from the real liquidy ones. It's still runny, but maybe it's a little bit thicker than the inks. And then you have the sometimes the paint has the property mixed in. For example, Golden has what they call open, which is a slow drying soft body acrylic paint. And so it already has that drying retardant mixed in with it, so it dries slower. And then you have soft body, which is kind of like heavy cream, somewhere between heavy cream and a toothpaste. And then heavy body, which is kind of like a toothpaste, comes in the tubes. And then super heavy body might be more like hair gel. There are special effects paints you can find with glitter. They can be fluorescent, iridescent, all sorts of specialty paints you can find. They also come in different finishes. You might find matte, satin, gloss, high gloss, etc. I've seen, sometimes they're exterior paints as well. So you can find a variety of formulas out there. Acrylic gouache is, like I said, more that pastel look. It looks like the watercolor gouache, except for that it dries permanent, just like other acrylics. They have markers now that you can use, and those are really nice for details. You can even touch up your paints, like if you want to do little highlights and you're just, maybe the brush just doesn't quite get the control that you want, you can find markers nowadays. Now the aerosols are not the water soluble, but they do come in aerosol, and you can use those in your projects as well. They're especially good with using for stencils and things like that. Now, I talked about the mediums, and mediums basically you can use under, in, or on top of acrylic paints. They're basically the polymer acrylic polymer with a various properties without pigment. And most of them are clear, so they don't impact the clarity or the color of your paint. They just change whatever the properties are. There are some exceptions to that. Now, in this case, to start with, we would use a gesso, which is a primer, and that's usually, you're not mixing that with the paints. You're usually laying that down as a primer before you paint. Although you can color the gesso if you want by adding some pigmented paint to it. It's going to dilute some of the gesso quality. The gesso basically has like a chalk in it that creates a lot of tooth. So it not only adheres really well to whatever substrate or base that you're putting it on, but it's also going to adhere really well to that paint. So it's going to make it grab on there better and less likely to peel up or loosen. And this is especially important if for porous type materials such as canvas. So we think about painting canvases as being the perfect substrate for painting acrylics, but canvases are actually usually pre-gessoed. That's what makes them white. They're probably, they might be white underneath there too, but they're basically just a woven cotton or linen, or they can even be synthetic fabric. And then they have the gesso painted over the top to not only seal the fabric, keep the paint from absorbing into it, but also creating a nice tooth to attach the next layer of acrylic onto it. It comes in a variety of options of different colors: white, black, clear. Sometimes there's pigmented ones as well, and it can come in different consistencies. I've seen it in just a typical more soft or fluid, and I've seen it in heavy and gel-like. So you can find it in different consistencies and different colors. And you want to use that if you're going to be going over paper that you don't, unless you're doing a watercolor technique. And if you're doing anything that's porous, you want to put a layer of gesso on there just to help secure it. When in doubt, put some gesso on there. And then there's different formulas of mediums. There's things that extend the drying time. And these are just some examples. Slow dry, which is a Liquitex product. And there's palette wetting spray, which is also similar to that. It comes in a spritz, so you can just spritz your palette periodically to just keep it from hardening or creating a crust around that paint. There's thinning agents like they use for airbrushing. Now, if you want to thin your paint to make it more of a liquid consistency and you don't want to use too much water, this airbrushing additive would be a great option for that because it's real liquid. So anytime you want to thin, you could use something like that. Glazing is for making it a little more transparent. And of course, anytime you thin it, you're going to make it a little more translucent than it was. But glazing is when you layer one color over the top of another color, and you want some of the color beneath to show through. So you're getting, maybe you're laying a blue underneath and then a yellow on top, and you want it to sort of look a little green. That's the glazing, the layering of color on top. And so if you add this glazing additive, it can allow you to do that with the acrylics. And that's something that watercolors do very nicely, but acrylics need a little bit of help. Pouring as well, if you want to make a do paint pouring, there's a pouring additive. There's also thickening options. There's gel. Modeling paste is usually something you would put down first. You can create a three-dimensional texture, and then you could paint over the top of it. You could also mix it with your color, but it'll make a nice three-dimensional thick shapes on your painting, like more like impasto. And you can also use the gel for that as well, or just get a heavy-bodied paint to do that as well. Now you can also change the adhesion. For example, if you want to paint on fabrics and you want it to be washable, you might need to add an additive that will allow you to allow that to be washable. It'll stick to the fabric, but it just might not adhere as well over washing it than if you add an additive. Same with glass. You might need to add something just to keep it from scratching off, because otherwise, if you take a razor blade to glass, you can scrape it right off. It'll stick to it, but if it has any kind of duress, it's gonna maybe either peel up or be able to be scraped up. So you've got to add some kind of adhesive property medium. You can also add things to change the finish, like satin, gloss, or matte medium, or to change effects of it, make it iridescent or crackle technique, or kind of stringy. Now you can also change the finish by adding a finish, and that's the varnish. And varnish not only can change the whole overall finish of it, the look of it, you can make it matte or gloss or whatever you want, but it also protects it from UV rays and keeps the color from fading and makes it a little bit harder, because acrylics tend to stay a little tacky and not probably obvious to the touch, but as dust collects, it can kind of stick to those little sticky particles, and the varnish is going to create a more hard surface that's going to keep that dust from sticking to it. There is removable and permanent varnish. It comes in a liquid typically, or a spray if you don't want to. Especially for delicate things, it's good to do either an airbrush or a spray, because you don't want to, if it's three-dimensional, you may not, like, let's say you did a floral or something three-dimensional on a canvas and you don't want to really brush into that, then a spray would be a great option for that, because you don't have to touch, you don't have to manhandle the project, and it's a little bit more delicate. So that can be helpful. There are endless possibilities. These are just some examples of acrylic projects that I've done. Everything from just basic painting to mixed media. This is acrylics on top of hot glue gun with some other inks, spray inks. You can, this is sort of that drink and paint night, what you probably find the basic, and this is very inexpensive craft paint. This is a watercolor effect. I did this on watercolor paper. This is mixed media again, just in a dollar store, one of the dollar store journals, writing books. So it's just basically lined paper, and I gessoed over that and was able to play around with acrylics on that. And then this is the paint pouring technique as well. So, and there's many more than this. This is just a sampling of what you can do with acrylics. And here's and again, this is only a sampling of all of the different techniques that you can do. Photo transfers, calligraphy, decorative painting, stenciling, murals, just endless possibilities with acrylics. So that's one of the things that's really great about it. All right, so basic supplies and materials that you're going to need. We talked a little bit about the acrylic paints themselves. But first, we want to talk about what you're going to paint on. And I talked about you can put it on just about anything as long as you prime it first. If it's something that's either smooth or porous, you're going to want to do some priming. But, you know, pick whatever you want. I mean, from a cereal box to a canvas, an official canvas. You could probably find something around the house that you could paint on already. And then the color palette. So a lot of people are like, well, what colors do you have? Now, the 3 primary colors, and sometimes the paints will actually call them primary red, primary yellow, primary blue. If you're not familiar with color theory, I do recommend you checking out that in my watercolor series, and also this color wheel, which I talk about every time I talk about color, because it's very helpful when you're trying to mix colors. Understand the primary colors can be mixed to make the secondary colors that could then be mixed again with primary colors to make tertiary colors. So the secondary colors are that, you know, blue and yellow makes green, blue and red makes purple, red and yellows makes orange. Those are the secondary colors. And then if you take, let's say, blue and yellow, which makes green, and then you take the green and add blue, you're going to get a bluish green. If you add more yellow, you're going to get a yellowish green. So you can kind of do this endless mixing. But so if you just want to do the basics, all you need is a primary, which is usually it's a magenta, a yellow. In this case, this is an example just from the basics line from Liquitex, but the medium azo. So kind of a medium yellow, and then cyan blue, or phthalocyanine is the full name. But cyan blue, if you look at printers, usually see magenta, you know, yellow, and then cyan blue. Same thing here. Now, you also probably, especially since it's acrylics and you do mixing, you don't just use the white of the paper. You're probably going to want some white, because that can lighten or tint those colors, and then black can shade those colors. Now, you can also get dark grays and blacks by mixing the 3 primary colors. So if you're only going to get 4, then you can mix the black, but I would for sure get white. You're definitely going to want some white. You can also do the split palette, and I talked about this in watercolors as well, getting a warm and cool of each of the primary colors. And then I like, for if you're going to add a green, which is a secondary color, the phthalocyanine green, and the dioxazine purple. And this phthalo green is a cool green. The dioxazine purple is a warm purple. But you can warm or cool those down by adding the next primary color. So that's not a problem. I'm not going to get a warm and cool of the secondary colors necessarily. And then for some neutrals, burnt umber is a good cool neutral, and you can mix it with the ultramarine blue to get like a kind of a blue-black look. So you can cool it down even more, make it more black. And then burnt sienna, I really like to mix that in as well as a warm neutral. So you got a cool and warm neutral. And 2 popular blacks that are on the market are Mars and Ivory. And I believe that Ivory is a little bit warmer than Mars. And I have both of them. I have to kind of look at. But basically, since black is a mix of 3 primary colors, they're going to lean one direction or another. If you were to dilute it down with white and get a gray color, you're going to see better what some of the undertones are. So it might turn more towards green, or it might turn more towards blue, or it might turn more towards red or brown. So, you know, black isn't going to be a pure color usually, and so mixing that can have different consequences. So try everything out ahead of time before you put it on your project. Titanium white is a very bright white, and that's a very popular white. So this would be if you wanted to do a bigger palette. But I'd also say, think about what projects you want to do. If you're going to only be doing ocean scenes, you might just want a bunch of blues and turquoises and yellows. And if you're going to be doing gardens, you might want a whole bunch of reds and greens. So think about what project you're doing, especially if you're getting some of the craft paints. There's a lot of selection, and you can pick them as you go along with what what your project is. this wheel has some tools to help you to pick colors that work well together. Like, for example, thinking about complementary colors, which are the colors opposite on the wheel. Those are great in contrasting each other, but if you mix those together on the palette ahead of time, you're going to get gray. So these wheels will help you. It's one wheel, actually, just two sides, but this is going to help you to understand the color mixing and do a better job of not getting those muddy colors, because that's one of the biggest challenges, is not getting muddy colors. And anytime you mix these three together, you're going to get mud. And sometimes you want it and sometimes you don't. So you have to decide. In order to keep the paint workable, we talked about that, being able to put a medium in that keeps it from drying as quickly. That's a way that you can keep the paint from drying anywhere. If you want to keep it from drying on the palette and you're not using the blending medium, you can periodically spritz your palette with a little bit of water, not too much, or a palette wetting medium, which is the same thing as basically this, just in a spray form. And then you can also try covering each of your colors with a little bit of some plastic wrap or something like that, just to keep it from evaporating out. And they do actually create what's called a wet palette. And I think I'm going to be talking about that, and I have a link for a do-it-yourself. There's a lot of YouTube videos out there about making your own. It's essentially a little tray with a moisture layer and then some parchment paper over the top, so it allows the moisture to come through. But they do have commercial wet palettes out there that you can get. So if you're doing a big project, the reason you might want something like this, if you're doing a lot of painting or you're doing a big project and you mix up these colors and you don't want to get rid of that paint at the end of the day and you have to wait for it to dry, or you just ran out of time, it's a way that you can save the paint for the next day. And so that might work. That might be something that you need. It might not be something that you need, but it just saves from throwing a lot of paint away. And do be careful when you're putting the paint on your palette, not to put more than you think you're going to need, just because once it dries, it's gone. And that's the one thing that, I mean, the acrylics can be kind of wasteful in that way, because with watercolor, it can be on the palette and that's good forever. It can be dried up in a tube and it's still good, still usable, but acrylics are not like that. So just be aware of that. Don't overfill your palette with a color if you're not going to be using that much of that color. You can always add more. So keep that in mind. Now on the canvas, you can, to start with, you can spritz the canvas surface before you start painting, and that just might help the paint glide a little bit better to start with. You're going to wet your brush. You're going to add a little bit of, so it's going to have a little bit of water in there. And anyway, but you can just, if you wet the surface, it's just going to help it kind of blend in there a little bit better. And you can add water, of course, as you paint, just not too much to where you get more than the 25% that we talked about. Now on the brush, you're going to want to rinse often and thoroughly, even if you're using the same brush. Sometimes if you're doing a lot of detail, you just might be out of the water for a long time, and it just may need to do a rinse midway through, just to make sure you're not getting any of that paint drying on the brush. Or if you're done with that brush for now, but you're going to use it again, you can rinse it real good and then put it in a moisture tray, which is just basically a little tray that has maybe a washcloth or some paper towel or something to keep it moist. Or I just sometimes will throw it in a Ziploc, like put it in a Ziploc, just so that it's not evaporating out if I've not thoroughly washed it. Now I'm going to rinse it as well as I can. I'm going to get all of the pigment that I can see off of it, but I'm still not going to trust that it's completely clean until I do a thorough wash at the end. I'm going to wash it again. So if I think I'm going to use that brush again, I'll go ahead and I can just put it somewhere where it's not going to evaporate too quickly in case there's some paint that I can't see. And then later I'm going to wash it thoroughly. Now, I'm going to talk more about brush care in a little while as well. So I'll say more about washing it thoroughly too. Now, as far as palettes go, I talked about that Stay Wet palette. You can use palette paper, which is like a wax paper. You can actually use wax paper. You can use the palettes that are out there in commercial palettes, but a lot of them are plastic, metal, or in enamel. And honestly, they might clean up good at the beginning, but if that surface starts to get scratched at all, it's just harder and harder to peel up that paint off of it. So I wouldn't recommend those ones, especially if they have little wells that you have to try to get the paint out of. It just can be tricky for cleaning. So the options that I like is something, they do have tempered glass palettes out there that are just basically a glass, almost like a cutting board. And I've actually tried to find a cutting board that had a smooth side. Unfortunately, a lot of them have that sort of bubbly glass that's hard, that you can't scrape with a razor blade. But I also have just taped off a frame, some glass from a picture frame. But be very careful if you decide to go this route, because they can break and it can be dangerous. But if you're just laying it flat on your desk and it's not going to be moved around or picked up or held, you could just do something like that, and just tape the sides, the sharp sides, but just be very careful not to, bump it or anything like that where you can break it, because if it's not tempered glass, it's going to break in sharp ways. And then, of course, there's the Stay Wet palette that'll keep paint viable for days. And here's the example and the link for the Make It Yourself Stay Wet palette. But you can also use things around the house that are disposable, like plastic lids from, your yogurt or whatever, disposable plates. If you're using those, I would say don't use the paper ones. If they have a wax coat, that's fine. It's just that the paper ones the water's gonna go soak through and they're gonna probably start to fall apart after a little bit. So that's probably not the best option. But if it's either styrofoam or wax coated, that should work okay. Foil, you can wrap something in foil if you want, or use cling wrap, like wrap it around a clipboard or something like that. You can make a palette like that. Wax or freezer paper will work as well, as long as you have a good surface you can set it on if you're just using the table. And then, like I said, the reusable DIY would be a smooth flat glass dish or cutting board. I mean, even a plate. I like it to be completely flat, because that way, if the paint tends to be really sticky, and I find that some of the craft paints stick more than some of the higher end paints, because they're just not as like flexible. The paint's not as flexible or something. But if it sticks to the glass or anything, I can just scrape it with my razor blade if it's flat. But if it's a rounded surface, then it's trickier to get it off. Ideally, if it's you got a thick coat of paint, you can peel it up and it's really easy to remove, but it doesn't always work out that way. So, but smooth flat glass dish or ceramic dish, something that has a smooth surface that the paint won't adhere to easily. This is just an example of a pad of palette paper, which is essentially like wax paper or freezer paper. So, but it comes in a pad, and you can just, and it's got a stiff back, so you could just use the whole thing if you want, or you could tear it off either way. All right, brushes. As I mentioned when I did the watercolor brushes, this is basically the anatomy of the brush. So you have your bristles, and I've heard both tip for the tip of the bristles and also toe. The belly is the midpoint that carries a lot of the paint. The heel, or the ferrule end here, this is the ferrule, the metal part, and that holds the bristles in. This part right here, you don't want to get the paint in there. So I'm going to be talking about that more, but I just wanted to point that out while I'm showing you the brush, because if you fill this, if this part starts to get acrylic paint in it, what'll happen is it dries there and starts to spread these bristles out, and they start losing the shape. And that's why you get those splayed brushes. And you can see that with house brushes all the time, because a lot of that paint gets trapped up in here. So try to keep the paint on the brush from the tip to the belly and avoid jamming it in. I mean, there's going to be times when it might be unavoidable, but just generally make an effort not to get too much paint up in this area. Now, inside the ferrule is where there's going to be glue to hold these bristles in. And this is exactly why I'm going to be talking about brush care and why it's not a good idea to just throw your brush into a jar of water and let it sit there like they do at the paint and drink nights. Which kind of drives me a little crazy, but they buy cheap brushes. They don't care. They know they're probably going to be abused anyway, so they just don't care. But if you're buying your own brushes, you're going to want to take better care of them. Now, there's also information about the brush. The size, I just want to bring that up. Just like the size in watercolor brushes, this number is arbitrary. It's really, it's not arbitrary for the company, but it's based on this company. So this is the 6th size in this company's line, okay? But that doesn't tell you what size it is. The size of this opening here of the ferrule, which is basically, you know, the size of the brush, is not necessarily in relationship to this number. Sometimes they'll have both. They'll have, oh, it's like 3 millimeters, and then they'll have a number 6. Or if you go to the company's website, it might say the number 6 is a 3 millimeter. But what you need to know is what this opening is because if you're following somebody else and you're trying to follow along with what they're using, and they say they have a size 6, but they're in a different brand than what you have, it may not be the size that you're working with. So just be aware of that because it can be a little bit confusing. What you want to know is the size of this opening because that's going to dictate the size of the brush. And the other thing, so the things you want to think about with the bristles is the coarseness, and that's the size of the filament. So the synthetic brushes, which is what I would recommend, they tend to be a finer, softer bristle or filament than some of the bristle brushes, which is the natural hair. When it's called natural hair bristle, that means it's a harder, firmer natural hair, like hog's hair, or boar hair. That's not going to be a soft sable, and you're not going to use those soft sables or swirls for acrylics because it's going to be really hard to clean them and it's going to damage the brush. So I would not recommend getting these sable brushes for your acrylics. I do recommend getting synthetic, but there are some applications for some of the firm bristle natural hair brushes. And acrylics can have a varied thickness of filaments as well. So if you want coarse, if you want those brush strokes to show, then you want a higher coarseness of the bristles, and you can shop for those. The snap, you want it to snap back to shape. You bend it and it snaps right back up. That's what you want, because the acrylics tend to be a heavier body paint and you need to be able to control them, and it's really hard to do that with a real soft brush. So typically you want a little more snap. The shape of the brush, now there's a couple of things to think about with the shape. I talked about the ferrule. The ferrule opening for this, in this case, is round, but just because this shape is round doesn't necessarily dictate what the shape is out here. So this is a pointed round, and sometimes there are round wash or mop brushes that splay out. So, but this is in general a round brush, and that's based on the ferrule opening. The opening is round. These ones have flat ferrule openings, but they're all, not this one, this is a round, but they're all different shapes. So this one is a flat brush tip, but it's shorter in length than this flat one. And this one's called a bright. And this is more for shorter, quicker strokes. You still want to have the flat edge because you're doing maybe something that's kind of geometrical, but this is for shorter strokes because you're not going to hold as much paint with the shorter bristles. This has longer bristles, so you can get longer strokes. So the flat brushes tend to be really good for doing washes or long background strokes covering the canvas. Obviously not this small, you get a lot bigger, but they hold a lot of paint and they can go longer than the bright brushes typically. And they just fill very quickly the page. You can also make lines with these. If you rotate the brush, you can make a long skinny line as well with either of these brushes. Now this one's called a filbert, and it is also a flat opening when the ferrule, but it's a rounded edge of the bristles, and that gives more rounded organic shapes. So if you're doing bushes and trees and flower petals and things like that, this makes a nice brush for those kinds of, you know, clouds and all those kind of round shapes. You can also use the round brush, but round brush also is really good for details, and it goes from a skinny to thick because you can paint either with the tip or the belly, and it gives you that real interesting petal shape as well. And then the fan brush is also a real popular one for acrylics. That's good for blending colors because it can be really soft, or else you can spread the bristles apart like this and make it look like little hairs, or it can be good for foliage, especially doing pine trees and things like that. So fan brush is a very popular special effects type of brush that you might want to have. So I would say of the brushes that are out there, you know, these are pretty good options to have. I don't know that you have to have a bright and a flat. You could maybe have one of those. I would say if you're going to have one, maybe have the flat. There's also some angled flats. They're flat shape here, but then it's an angle here, and that can give you tighter angles and corners. And then there's also daggers. There's some different shapes out there, but these are some basic shapes that I think would be helpful if you're going to get a set. And then other tools, of course, palette knives is an important one to have, because rather than mixing colors, if you're going to try to mix colors, instead of mixing with the brushes, you can use the palette knife, and that'll save your brushes. And again, I'll talk more about brush care in a second, but also you can use cut up credit cards. You can use chopsticks. You can use pretty much anything to be a tool to create texture or to do fun things with your paintings. You can use a comb. You can use a toothbrush for splatter. So there's lots of different fun tools. That's pretty endless too. You can use things around that you find in the kitchen to create like stamp tools and things like that. So, but I would for sure at least have a palette knife, or you, like I said, you could use a cut up credit card as a palette knife if you don't want to invest, and that'll come in handy in lots of different ways. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like if you're not sure what a palette knife is. All right, so the materials that the brush head is made of, there's the natural bristle, and I talked about the difference between a bristle versus just a natural brush. They call them bristles if they're more firm and more coarse. So what you would use more likely in acrylics would be like a hog or boar hair, rather than those, like I said, those delicate natural hairs. You probably wouldn't use those too much. And these are also what you would use in oil, because oil is another one you have to have a firmer touch. They are more likely to shed, so keep an eye on that. They do soften more when they're wet compared to the synthetic, which holds its shape better because, you know, it's basically polyester or nylon. And because they're coarse, it has a little more texture usually, but there is a range of textures you can get even in the synthetic. So you could probably find a coarser brush if you wanted to. They're good for heavy body paints, the natural bristle, and likewise the synthetic. Now they do hold more paint and water because they're porous, but that's also why they're more difficult to clean. So you're more likely to ruin a natural bristle brush than you will a synthetic, because synthetic's just going to release that paint a little bit easier. The softer the brush, the better for blending, for the smoother blending between colors, if that's the look you're going for. If you really want it to be painterly and show all the brush strokes, then you may not want that really smooth brush. So it really depends on the technique you're going for and what brush is going to be best for the job that you're doing. You're going to get, like I said, a smoother brush stroke. So that means you're not going to see all of the different, see how you can, in this slide, you can kind of see these brush strokes here. That's because it's a dry brushing, but with over here, you can't see anything. And that's what you want. sometimes, and sometimes you want this. So it really depends on what you're looking for. They're more durable, so they're going to hold up better. They're not going to start, you know, splitting and fraying as quickly as the natural bristle brush will. All right, brush care. So here are some tips for how to take care of your brushes while in use. For starters, when you get a new brush, oftentimes they'll feel really firm. So if you bend them in the store, they'll be real stiff. And in order to know really whether they're snappy or not, you got to kind of break up that starch. It's really gum arabic usually that's just holding, kind of like a hair pomade that's holding those bristles in shape for storage and travel. So to really understand how snappy it is, you know, you got to kind of loosen that up a little bit. But before you actually use the brush, you're going to want to rinse that off real good in water, just to make sure that you're not, that's not diluting your paint at all. It's just some gum arabic. Just rinse them real good. I mentioned avoid getting paint in that ferrule because that'll damage the shape of your brushes and it's hard to get out once it gets in there. Mix the colors with a palette knife rather than the brush, and that'll help keep it from getting in the ferrule. Avoid leaving them in the water dish, as I mentioned before. Just swish really fast and furious. And I also would avoid smashing it against the bottom of the brush. But I will say that if you have synthetics, those are going to be more durable and it's probably not going to affect them as much. If you have like one of those little brush massagers at the bottom of your water dish, or you run it on the bottom. But you don't want to have your brushes sit in the water, not only because I talked about that water really wicking up through the ferrule and loosening that adhesive, it also gets into that wood, which expands the wood, and then the wood shrinks, and then it breaks all of the coating on the wood, and then just it damages the brush. But also you don't want the bristles to start shaping. They'll start to lean, like from just the weight of that brush sitting on them, the bristles will start to shape to the side. Now there are ways to reshape them, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's another thing you don't want, another reason you don't want to have your brushes sit in the water like that, and B, you don't want to store your brushes brushed down because you don't want them to get damaged and change the shape permanently. You want to minimize the time that the ferrule and the handle is submerged. That's because of damaging that water and loosening those bristles. You want to rinse often and thoroughly. So just usually what I try to do just to limit the water, or I'm sorry, limit the paint that gets in my rinse water, not only to keep my water as clean as possible, but also it's not great for your plumbing. It's not, you know, not all the ingredients in some of these paints is great for the environment. Like cadmium's a heavy metal that's, you know, there's questions about whether it's safe. Some people say, oh yeah, it's safe unless you sand it or heat it, but it's probably not great in the water supply. So I just try to eliminate as much in whatever goes down my drain as possible to save my plumbing, because it could adhere to the side of your plumbing as well. So what I usually do is I try to, if I'm done using that brush, that color, I try to get as much of the paint off of it as possible. And you can either do that by getting it onto your painting if that works, or you can wipe it on your palette, or you can take a rag. And I usually use like an old t-shirt or something that's, you know, seen better days. And I just cut it up into little pieces and I make rags out of them. Or you can use paper towels. I just try to, you know, I try to be as just aware of trying to use reusable things as possible. And then I just wipe it from the ferrule down, away from the ferrule. I kind of pinch it and pull out as much of the paint as possible. And then I can rinse it and do the same thing, rinse it, pull, you know, try to kind of milk out any of that paint that's in there. And until I don't see any more pigment, I'm going to just wring it really fast, like back and forth in the water, and just try to get as much of that pigment color. And you should see on your rag that the color starts to go clear if you've gotten all the paint. And then you can lay it in that moist tray or bag just to keep it from drying out. And then do not store them with the bristles up until they are completely dry. So while they're drying, if you have something that can suspend them in air, you can put them bristle down and hang them off of a brush dryer, or you can lay them flat, and then once they are dry completely, then store them upright so that the bristles aren't touching anything else, because you don't want the bristles bumping into stuff, because that'll change the shape of the bristles. So it's good to store them up, or just to free, you know, so they're not touching anything else that's going to misshape them. But while they're drying, you don't want to store them like that, because that'll run that water down into the ferrule and loosen up that adhesive faster.
Yeah, well, I have a question and a comment about the cleaning the brushes. I like to have either a piece of paper or like a spare canvas where I use to clean my brushes, and then I can rip that piece of paper up and use in my scrapbook.
That's a great idea. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a great idea. Okay, so great ideas. Thank you so much for sharing those tips, and write down any other ideas that you have and you want to share at the end as well, because that's part of what this community is about, is sharing information, and that's what's so great about getting creatives together, because we all have good ideas. Okay, so washing tips for the final wash. So after I use my brushes, I always do a final wash, whether I think I've gotten everything out of there or not. There's always maybe hidden molecules of the polymer in there, and I don't find out until later. And trust me, I found out later. But so I always like to do a final rinse, and I do like to use a detergent or something. And there are different options. There are actual brush cleaners out there. You can use hand soap. If you're cleaning a natural brush, you may want conditioners in it. I don't know if conditioners are useful for synthetic. I wouldn't think so, but I'm not the expert on that. But there are brush cleaners that have a conditioner mixed in, like I think it's the Masters brush cleaner is one of those, and that's good for, especially for the natural brushes. And then I think about Dawn detergent, because Dawn is used for rescuing animals from oil spills. So I would think that's safe enough also for a natural brush. But I don't know about other dish detergents. But just, you can put a little bit of either brush soap or whatever you're going to use. If it's synthetic, they're probably pretty durable, and you can use just any kind of soap or any kind of dish detergent. But just put a little bit in your palm, and then massage your brush there, and then kind of work it with your fingers, pulling it down away from the ferrule, making sure to spread the bristles, and just working those bristles as much as you can to get any of that color out of there. The foam, the suds are going to change color if there's still pigment in there, and if it's clear and no color, unless of course you were painting with white. But if it's clean and clear, eventually it'll rinse clean and clear, and then that means that you've gotten all of that out of there, hopefully. Then once that happens, you reshape the brush with your fingers to make, to bring it to a tip or a point, and that just keeps the bristles from drying in a weird shape, because they tend to want to stay that way. And I've actually heard you can use the hair pomade to shape them if you are trying to reshape a brush that's just not, maybe it's flaring a little bit or turning. You can try that. See if drying it that way with some hair pomade helps get it to retrain itself. But so that's one little tip. But then I dry flat or suspend with the bristles down, and then once it's dry, you can store it up. And then if you've left some paint on the brush, there are ways to clean it, and there's a bunch of videos online. Some of them are pretty, can be harsh, like acetone. If it's synthetic, it's going to be more durable against these things. If not, it may not be. But like I wouldn't want to put acetone. Well, you can try them out. I haven't used any of these, so I can't really speak to that. I have done the boiling trick, which I'll talk about in a minute. But these are just some things I found online. And so it is possible for you to recover a brush that's been damaged. Just be aware, especially like the boiling, you don't want to put the whole ferrule in there, or I wouldn't put the whole ferrule in the acetone or the other stuff either, because again, there's those adhesives in there that you don't want to ruin. So try to just keep the bristles in whatever the solution you're going to try, whether it's the brush cleaner or not. Just try to be careful not to damage the rest of the brush. Obviously, if it's not usable, you know, and you can make it usable, then that's better than nothing. And so maybe a little damage to the glue you can handle. But the problem is the bristles start to come out, and with acrylics, they get stuck in the acrylic paint, and then you have these little like later on, you don't notice them when you're painting maybe, and then later you find that there's a bristle stuck in there, and that's not good. And then you have to dig it out. It's this weird shape, and it's not easy to deal with. So so it's important not to have, that's another reason not to have cheap brushes that just kind of fall apart. So you want to make sure that you don't leave bristles in there. Now, if you store the bristle down and it's bent, you can boil the water. And if you dip just the bristles in that boiling water, I again wouldn't dip it down through the ferrule, just because I think that boiling water would soften the adhesives or damage the handle if it's wood. But then you can just set the bristles in there and then reshape them, and that kind of like it irons them out straight. And again, you can try the hair product too. All right. And then I have a bunch of videos and different resources here you guys can check out if you're interested. If you do decide to download the notes, and you can do that at creatingspacecoastal.com. Okay. Hi, everybody. Just a gentle reminder to please like, subscribe, or share if you find this content helpful. Thank you. That helps me. Let's get back to the program. Well, let's start with the substrate. So substrate is what you're going to paint on. And I'm just going to show you some examples of things that I have and that's available out there. So you can use a cereal box. Just make sure that you gesso it before, and that'll kind of seal it. I would even gesso it maybe on both sides just to make it a little bit firmer. But that's a great cheap option that you can find in your recycling. If you're doing a watercolor effect, you can of course use watercolor paper. You can use, this is called canvas paper, and it comes in a pad, and basically it's just the canvas that's gessoed already. So it's a little like a stiffer than just the fabric, but it also already has the gesso on it, and it comes in a pad kind of like just the watercolor paper would come in.
Is that acrylic, the palm tree painting, or is that watercolor?
This is acrylic.
Oh,
yeah,
it's not
acrylic.
very pretty.
And it's very flexible. So, you know, it stays.
Oh, cool.
This is early days. And then the next option is, these are called canvas panels. And it's basically like a chipboard. So it's a thicker cardboard with canvas that's wrapped around it. So it's firm. So that's another option. And then they also make the canvas board, which is actually on like a press board. This one is actually not, this is my first one. What's my first acrylic? And this one's called clay board. So it actually has a clay, which is an absorbent ground material that you can use. You can actually use it with watercolor or acrylics. It comes painted with a,
Oh, okay.
I think it's some kind of absorbent. It's an absorbent ground. So it's a clay. So you
Okay.
can actually use watercolor on this.
Do you have to prime the wood ones like that?
Well, you can actually make your own. So if you, let's say you went to the hardware store, you bought a bunch of this like press board, you could cut it down in shapes and then you just prime it. You just prime it with gesso and it's good to go. So you could make your own. And I don't know if they sell it. I don't know if they sell it for art that's not primed. Probably. I've never purchased it like that, but they might have it. But you could, like I said, you could just buy it at your hardware store and cut it down to the size you want and make your own. And then this is more of those boards that are just like like a chipboard, sort of like a pressed cardboard that's thicker. And these are those some paint pouring examples. Of course, the common thing that you'll see is canvas, and this is already primed. It already has its coat of gesso as well. See, if you look at the back, you'll see that really the natural color of this canvas is kind of a beige, and then if it's white because it's been painted. Now you can prime it again with the gesso if you prefer a smoother finish. Let's say if you don't like the texture of the canvas, because it is textured, you can put more coats of gesso if you want a smoother foundation. Some people just put an extra coat just because they want to make sure it's got a good coverage. I don't know if that's necessary or not. Personally, I don't usually do that, but and then this was some dot painting that I did on an old record. And I did sand a little bit, and I put some black gesso on this to prime it so that it would stick better, because if I didn't, the plastic, it would just, if I could probably scrape it with my fingernail and just pull that paint off. And this, maybe if I worked really hard, I could get it to lift, but it's going to take a lot more effort because that gesso is going to help it stick better. And then, of course, there's painting rocks. And you can on glass. These are just some other dot painting projects. Now, this one is, the dots are on the inside, so it's protected. But I can scrape those off because I don't have any kinds of adhesion additive to that or anything like that. But it's framed and it's protected, so I don't have to really worry about it. And I can reuse this frame and do a different art project if I want to.
Shauna, when you paint on glass like that on the back of it, how do you sketch out anything, or do you just freehand the paint?
Actually, what I did is I did a printout, and then I put the printout under the glass like a coloring page, and then I just followed the outline on the glass because I could see through it. And then
Oh, okay. That's smart.
That's smart.
and then
What
I
a
just flip
great
the glass around
idea.
and put it in the frame, and then it protects. You can have the paint on the outside too, and as long as you're not really messing with it, it's gonna it's gonna stay a while. And then when you want to change up the design for the season, you can just scrape it off and then start over. Okay, the next thing, of course, is paint. And I have a variety of paints in my collection, everything from crafts. I mean, all the way from some dollar store crafts. I don't even know where this one is from, but this is Craft Smart. Now you'll notice that they, they usually have this approval from the like art association. So it's basically saying it's conforms to a chemical standard. So you'll usually see that, but this doesn't have a lot of other information on it. This one, same thing. You'll notice that this is a more student grade, but but this one does have some information. Let's see. This is going to tell me some information about the formula. This is telling me the light fastness. It's telling me what the vehicle or the what the makeup of it is. It's acrylic emulsion. And then it's also telling me the pigment colors. And I mentioned that before because that can help you determine really the composition of what the pigment is made of. So if you're trying to compare two names that one company might call it light blue and one might call it cerulean blue, but you want to see if they're roughly the same blue, you can look at the pigment that's used. Now, it may still may not guarantee that the color is going to match exactly, but you're going to get closer if you understand what pigment chemical is being, or mineral or whatever is being used. And these will give you a clue. And those are usually on either the student or the professional grades. You're not going to usually find that kind of information on the craft grades. And this one I can see a little bit better. So except for I can't, it's still not really, oh, there we go, a little bit. So PW6, for example, is pigment white 6. So if I'm trying to match this white, and maybe this one's called titanium white, and then it's called Christmas white in this brand, I can look here and say, oh, it's made from the same pigment, so it should be pretty close. So I can at least know where to start. But again, that's not a guarantee that it's going to match exactly, but it's going to get you closer than if this was if this was pigment white 5, you know it's not going to match, or pigment white 4. So all of the pigments, the whole database of pigments, I have a link on my handout that shows you what those pigments are. Let me just give you guys, I think this is really helpful. Let me share that with you. So this is that website, and this is for acrylics, oils, or watercolors, because basically the pigments are the same, or at least it's the same database. So I can pick any pigment. I can go on here and say, okay, this is pigment PW6. I can go to my white pigments, and I can look down here. I can go to PW6 on the chart. And all of these are different names that you might find for the same pigment in different brands. And it even has a brand reference. These usually are related to whatever the brand, like this is probably Schminke, for example. So in Schminke, it's called titanium opaque white, but it's all the pigment white 6, and titanium white is the historic name based on the original chemical or mineral that it was made of. But you can see there's all these other names that other companies are going to use. So that can be a little bit confusing when you're trying to compare, especially if you're watching somebody online and they're using this brand and you're using a different brand. This is a way that you can try to get to the closest color to what they're using by going to this database. So that's really helpful, I think, because I'm OCD that way. But if you're not, just don't worry about it. Yellow's yellow. So the acrylic book is free, and it's a Liquitex book, and you can print it off. I printed the whole deal, and it breaks down all the different mediums, that you can use them for, what the benefits are. It talks about the makeup of acrylics. I mean, it's really like the history of this acrylic medium. And it also even has applications, like this is talking about doing acrylic skins and how you can do it. Here's the directions, applications. And there are even examples of videos on their website that show you how to do these different things. There are little short clips of, there's airbrushing, there's masking techniques, brush work, different. I mean, it's really like a whole awesome book on acrylics. So I've read the whole thing because I'm weird like that. But it even has fabric painting ideas. So they're just very knowledgeable, and this is a great resource. And so I have the link to the PDF in my free resources. And I also have the link in this handout in the resource section. There's a link directly as well. And they even have, like, if you're using the Basics brand in acrylics, it has like a little 101 fundamentals about using basic, like what all their colors are, what mediums you have to choose from within that line. So it's very, very resourceful, the website. And other websites I'm sure have some stuff too. I went to Golden and they had some things, but it just didn't have as much. I think the Liquitex had quite a bit of resources to help people with working with acrylics. So that's the reason I included that. So this is the Golden brand, and this was their fluid line. So this one is really thin. You pour it from a bottle, and I'm not going to show it just yet, but next week I'll start actually doing some demos with these and show you the different textures. But so this is liquid, comes in a bottle. The acrylic inks are really thin. You can actually use a dip pen with those. I think even they have dropper bottles and things like that. There's the acrylic markers. Usually you have to shake them And they have different tips. This is a chisel tip, but they have finer ones as well. This I think is a round tip that's been used a lot. And then I have, even in the tubes, there's the soft body and then the heavy body. And I even have this one that was a heavy body, and I don't know why, but this one for some reason is hard. So this one is gone. It no longer squeezes out. So it's dried up for some reason. I don't know if that's because I didn't have the cap on. So just be really careful to make sure that you get the cap on tight, or if something happens where there's a hole in the tube. These are plastic tubes, not the metal tubes. Sometimes the metal tubes can crack. But if that happens to you with an acrylic, just make sure you try to seal off that crack and or put it in a baggie or something to keep it alive, because otherwise it'll die. And this is one of my favorite colors, is raw sienna, so that's unfortunate. So that's no longer in my repertoire, but yeah, I do, you know, I use a little bit of everything depending on the project I'm doing. I would never use these, I wouldn't likely use these professional quality ones to do something like my dot painting, or using it for my paint pouring where I'm, you know, using a lot of pigments. And if I was doing it to sell, then maybe I would for those projects, but I use this more for my canvas work and, you know, for my fine painting. And then for craft projects, I just use craft level paint because, you know, if it doesn't last as long, if it cracks or whatever, I don't care as much, you know, if that happens on my rock, but I do care if it happens on the canvas. Okay, now, oh, and then I have these, this is just a little, I think it was a free set with something else, and it's a student quality, but it's got the primary colors. And this one doesn't even say really what they are. It just says primary red, primary yellow, and ultramarine blue. So it's interesting that it has the ultramarine blue, but it doesn't tell you what those two are. And I don't even know if it has the pigment index on it. But anyway, these should work together to mix up some other colors. I think it's fun to play around, just like we did with the watercolors, play around with the colors that you have and see what they do together. And that's the project we're going to do next week. We're going to do a more abstract project, but we're going to be mixing paints and seeing what colors we can make with our paint palette. I do recommend doing the split palette where you have the warm and the cool. The cool thing about these labels is that it actually shows you, and this is different than, I haven't seen these on the watercolor because the watercolor tubes are smaller because you're using more of this than you use with the watercolor. But what's really cool about this label is that it shows you the relative warmth on here. So Alexa, dismiss. So for example, this shows, it's like a little meter. So this is red and this is yellow. So those are the two primary colors. And then this is yellow, red in the middle. And then this little arrow is where this falls between the red and yellow. So you can tell if it's a warmer or cooler color. If it goes more towards the yellow, it's cooler. If it goes more towards the red, it's warmer. And that's white, so you're not going to really see anything there. And oh, this is black. Oh, yeah. So here it's purple, which is moving more towards the blue. So this is P for purple and R for red. So as it moves closer to the red, it's warmer, and closer to the purple, it's cooler. So if you're picking a warm and cool color of each of your primaries, then this little symbol is going to help you figure that out. So this would be my more cool magenta, and this is my more warm red. So I think it's a good idea to have the mix of those, because you're going to have a wider range than if you just have the primary colors. But if you're just starting out, you just want to dabble, you know, start with the primary colors and then go from there. Primary colors, black and white, or at least white, if not with black also. All right, that's my pigmented colors. And then, of course, there's all of the additives, and I'll just show you a couple of what they look like. So this, for example, is slow dry blending medium, and it's real, you know, liquidy. And I can add this to any of my acrylics, and it's going to make it take longer to dry and allow me to blend a little bit longer with it before it dries. So this is an example of that. It can be kind of gel-like, or it can be liquidy. This one is pretty liquidy. This is a medium. This is a gloss medium. So if I wanted to turn, now acrylics tend to be kind of a satin or kind of a shiny satin to gloss look anyway. But if I wanted it to be more glossy, I could either mix this with this, or I could lay a coat of this on top of it and I would get a gloss finish. You can also use this as glue if you're doing mixed media. You can use this to lay down as your adhesive for collage materials, and you would just use the thinner consistency if you're doing thinner collage materials like paper. And then if you were using three-dimensional collage materials like flowers or buttons, you would use a gel. Here's an example of a matte medium. So oftentimes if I'm doing if I am doing mixed media and I just want to have good adhesion, depending on what I'm using, the matte is a little easier for other things to stick to. So I might use that for my glue to lay down my pages rather than the gloss. If I want other types of medium to stick better, if I'm not just using acrylics, or if I don't want a gloss finish, I would use that. But I could always end with a gloss varnish. I can't speak. If I want it glossy in the end, but I just want more adhesion during the process, I could do that. I could use matte to lay down my paper collage, and then when I'm all done, I could just lay a varnish over a gloss, or I could even lay a layer of the gloss medium over the top just to get a final sheen. This is the flexible modeling paste, and that's more like a hair pomade, and that's for creating real thick texture. I could use that with stencils, for example, or I could just use a knife and kind of create some texture, and then I can paint over the top of it. Now, this is one of the examples of mediums that does not dry clear. I believe this dries white, whereas some of the other gels, usually the other mediums, are clear. So this would impact the color. If I mix this in with, let's say, red, it might turn it a little pink. So knowing whether or not it's going to be clear or not is helpful. I don't know if it says that. I think it's just something that I'm, from my experience, that I found. So this, I think, is better to do underneath the coat of color rather than mixing directly with it. Here is an example of clear gesso. This is the primer, and it just looks white, but it's gonna dry clear. And I talked about those modeling paste being textured and being white. It dries white, or maybe this one dries clear. Now I'm starting to set, you know what? I think I got that reversed. Sorry. If I use, I'm not positive about the modeling paste. I know if I use the soft gel, or if I use a heavy gel, that's going to dry clear. But if I used a heavy gesso, that's going to dry white. Like this is going to dry clear.
Is that considered a gesso too? Those golden products you're showing us?
This particular one is not. This is the soft gel. So this is just the acrylic medium. It's this texture, and it's gloss. So if I added it to any of my paints, it would make it, it would thicken it because it's a thicker well, depending on the thickness of the paint I was adding it to, but it's
Okay.
going to make it a little thicker and it's going to make it glossy.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So this is not the primer. It doesn't have any tooth in it. It doesn't have any of the chalk to make the tooth like the gesso has. This is an example of a super heavy gesso. It's not a clear gesso, so this is going to dry white. So I couldn't mix this in with color without it turning more of a pastel because it's going to be adding a white pigment to it. But I could use it like a modeling paste underneath to get texture. So if I wanted to create some texture, I could use gesso as well. Maybe I could use it with stencils. I could also thin it down and use it like a normal gesso. So this gives me a little more flexibility because I could thin it down a little bit with water and not over 25%, but I could thin it down with some water, or I could use it thick. So it gives me some variation with one product. This is just an older thing of white gesso, but it's just normal, soft bodied. You know, I could probably at one time I could pour it slowly, but it's pretty thick. Not as thick as this, but it's usually more like just a latex or one of the craft paints consistencies, like one of these. It's more like that. This is, I think I talked about the varnish. This is the, oh, maybe I didn't. This is a high gloss varnish, and see how liquidy that is. I don't know if you can see it because every time I turn it, but it's real liquidy. You want it nice and soft because you don't want to see brush marks. You want it to be able to just gently cover whatever it is that you're working on. And you want it to dry really, you want it to self-level or not show any of the brush strokes as much as possible. So you want to use a nice soft brush to apply that.
Some of those gessos that we're kind of getting to the bottom of the jar and maybe drying a bit more and getting thicker, are they water-based? Like, can you thin those to use the rest of it or not?
Yeah, you can add a little water. As long as it hasn't hardened all the way,
Yeah.
as long as it hasn't cured, you could still thin it a little bit.
Okay.
And then I have the black gesso, and I'm not going to open this because it's going to put black crusties all over my my desk if I do, because I always get a little bit in the, but it's just basically, you know, looks like black paint. And if you're doing a project where you want dark colors to start with, you might want to start with black gesso instead of the white gesso. And that'll make it cover, you have to use less paint to cover it if you're trying to make a darker underpaint. And then this is an example of, this is a pearl iridescent. So it's got that special iridescent effect to it. And you could probably mix this with a color too. It's probably, I don't know if it would, I don't know if it would turn it. I think it's pretty clear. It just has the iridescence. So I think you could use it as an additive with another color to give it iridescence, but I haven't tried that. And then this is a crackle. So this you would paint over the top of a darker color, and it dries white and it cracks. So you can get a crackle effect. So there's endless possibilities out there. As I said, there's so many different variations of additives, or, you know, mediums and formulas. I mean, for just about any project you could find. Now, you're going to want water, and I recommend large containers. You can just use like yogurt containers or whatever, but I like glass because acrylic cleans off glass pretty easily. Because like I said, you would need an additive to make it adhere better to glass. So usually the smooth surfaces work a little better for cleanup. If it's a plastic, you know, recyclable, it probably doesn't matter too much because you just get rid of it if it gets stained. Now, as far as my brushes go, I have a very mishmash. I mean, a lot of these brushes, you know, like a friend gave them to me, or I mean, I've did the mix. And you'll notice a lot of these are long handled, and I meant to mention, I don't know if I mentioned that or not, but the long handles are designed so that you can paint holding it at the end, the back end here. So if I want to get a good perspective of a canvas, I can stand back far away as I'm painting, and that allows you to do that. So if you're using an easel and a larger canvas and you're standing at it or whatever, then this would be handy to have to be able to, you know, paint at a distance. But if you're doing detail on the table, the long handles can be really kind of cumbersome because, you know, you can hit yourself in the face and stuff. So depending on what you're doing, what size, you know, whether you're going to be working on a desk, tabletop, you can get a desktop easel that sits right on top of your desk and holds it at an angle. And part of that is so you can see the full perspective, because when you lay it down, you know, what's further away from you is going to look a little bit skewed compared to what's close to you. And this is in a medium like watercolor where the gravity is going to pull it down into the paper, you know, typically. So you can work on a more vertical surface. So it is, you know, it can be nice to work with it looking directly this way, but you can also work on it down. This is an example of a shorter handle. And this is a mop, but this is a little bit softer. This would be really good for blending out color or creating really soft cloud, you know, really blended clouds and things like that. Typically, this isn't what I would use for a lot of my painting, but for the special effects, I like the flat brush. And you can see now, see how when you can even probably hear it. You can hear those bristles just, they're real firm and they flick right back into shape. And that's what you want. You don't want them to just be kind of, you know, floppy, because you want to be able to control that firm medium. Now this is a ruined brush. Well, and I'm going to see if I can revive it, but you can see like the bristles are all stuck together. I did not clean it well. And so that's unfortunate. And so I'm going to see if I can revive that one. I'm going to try one of those techniques. And then I have this round brush. See how nice and firm that is. Now this is a tiny round detail. Actually, it's got a flat. It's kind of pinched. This is a really small few hairs just for really fine details. If I want to put a little bit of a reflection in the eye of a toad, you know, I mean, really small details. So you can have every range of size of color. I mean, even doing a big painting, I might want a small detail like that if I, you know, on certain things. So it just really depends. This is a long, really long bristled flat, and it's pretty soft. It springs back, but it's not quite as firm. See, you guys can hear, I don't know if you guys can hear that compared to, I hear nothing. This would be great for blending, really blending out some colors lightly, like you're just really dusting it, but it's going to be hard to control. It's going to be hard to control the paint. You can even use hardware store paintbrushes, but just be aware that's like, this is a dollar store brush. And if you manipulate it and you get hairs that come out, see how the bristles are just coming out willy-nilly, and it's brand new. I've never even used it. This would make me nervous. It's got nice soft ends of the bristles, but I don't want to shed. So I would be, I don't know, I would probably be a little nervous using that. But something like that, like a 2-inch paintbrush, just for doing either gesso or doing the background color, would be great for a bigger canvas. Again, it depends on the size of your canvas. This is fine if it's not too big of a canvas. It's a pretty good size. I could do. There's these craft, these are pretty soft. They're firm, but they're soft tip, meaning that they're fairly fine. They're not a coarse bristle, meaning they'll give me nice smooth brush strokes from what I could tell. So that would be a nice blending or background brush as well. And they have different widths. So if I was doing a bigger canvas, I could use that. They're not quite as firm as like this one, but that's okay because I don't really want, you know, I want the brush strokes not to show, so I can just feather it in really nicely and get some really good blending. Now these are examples of some bristle hair. See, these are natural hairs and they're pretty coarse. So I'm going to get, and you can even see how they're starting to kind of, you know, flare out a little bit just from use. They're just not going to stay as nice and smooth and durable as the synthetic, but they give you good texture even at this level, even though it's not perfect, you know, it's kind of frayed a little bit. This still would give me some interesting texture and I could still use it. But I just have to understand what I'm using it for. This isn't going to be my fine, smooth lines, my smooth washes. This is going to be maybe some texture, maybe some foliage, things like that in the background. Same with some of these. And then this is a synthetic filbert. That's nice and stiff. They also make blended ones where it's a mix of the natural fibers and the synthetics as well. But again, I just recommend, especially for beginners, I think you'll be happy with the synthetics and no harm in animals, and also just easier to clean up. And then I do have a fan brush, which, you know, I do think is really helpful. So I do recommend, I think I have one in my watercolor collection, and then I have one here as well, because I like to do foliage. But if you're not doing any kind of landscaping, I mean, it really depends on the type of painting you're doing and what brushes you might need. This is way more than I need. I just collected them over the years. I just need a few of these. I really wish I didn't damage this brush because I like the size of that. Here's a big round synthetic brush. Oh, I can use this. I guess I could use this one. It's not as good as the synthetic. Oh, it's new. I don't know if I have a good, see if I have a good Filbert synthetic that I can use. It's a good size. I like the size of this, but it's a little bit coarser. This would be good for, this would be fine for clouds and things like, and foliage too, because I don't need it to be perfectly smooth. So this would probably be okay. And then this is a longer round, more of like a rigger brush where I can do some long like vines or tree branches, things like that. That's going to give me those wispy lines that I want for some of my details. Okay, so that's the majority of the brushes. This one's going to give me some real texture. That one's beat up. The natural ones break off as well. But then you get a really cool stamping. I mean, that would make great leaves, you know, in a tree or something like that. So just because they are, you know, kind of dying doesn't mean they're not functional. And then this, of course, is for doing stenciling, and that's a bristle too. That's pretty firm. And if you're doing stenciling, you just kind of dab on, and that's another technique you can use in your paintings as well. All right, I do have a bunch more brushes, and I'm just going to show you my brush case. This is what I store my brushes in, and it sits up, so it has a little, some Velcro. So I can put my brushes in there, and then I, you know, for travel, it works real nice. For traveling with my brushes, because you don't want your bristles to get all beat up, and trying to travel with them would be really tricky if you don't have some kind of they have rolling ones and all sorts of things, but just, you know, protect them and they'll last a long time. I've had these brushes for a long time. All right, and I want to talk a little bit about the palette. This is an example of the palette paper, and this is just like, it's a kind of like a wax paper. It's, I guess it's more like freezer, a little thinner than freezer paper, but it's waxy on one side and not on the other. And you can use, you know, just put your paints right on there, and then it just easy cleanup. You can use, like I said, the plastic pellets, but I don't necessarily recommend that. If you do want to seal them up, you can get containers that close and seal up. Maybe add a dry retardant to them. But this is an example of what I've used for some dot painting. I just put the paint mixed in there, and then I actually sealed it up like that. And it was just craft paint, and someone said you could put it in the freezer. So I tried it. I put it in the freezer, and then I pulled it out before I finished my next project, because I had them all mixed, and it actually worked. But again, this was not a project that I cared about the archival quality of it. I probably wouldn't do that if I was doing a fine art, but it is an option if you want to seal up your paints. You could, you know, put them in that and then just close it up when you're working, and then you can go back into them. The challenge with this is cleanup. Just getting the acrylics out of these wells might be a bit tricky, even though they're kind of smooth, but I can't get my blade in there. You know, that's the thing, is I can't, you know, there's a little bit of paint still stuck in there. Usually you can peel it up, but it just might be a little tricky. But that's an idea if you want to try something like that. This is an idea for when I have my brushes and I'm working on my project and I rinse them, and I have some water in this, so this is wet, and then I can just lay my brush that I'm either going to use again later, or I'm waiting to do the master dry. I can just kind of lay the bristles on top of this wet towel. This would be wet, and then I could cover it to even keep the evaporation out, and then that would just keep my brushes from completely drying before I have time to fully wash them. So that's an idea, just to extend the time of for your brushes. And then here's an example of my DIY glass palette. So this is just from a frame, and I tried to pick one that's fairly thick, because there's some that are just really, really thin, and I would just be afraid to do anything with them. But I put tape around the edges, and then I painted with gesso. I just did a white gesso layer on the back, so that way it's white. Because I do like to have my palette white, because I think it can show my color. Well, I've seen these in gray, like they sell them actually for palettes in gray, but I don't know if I would like that as much. Maybe there's a reason that that's a good idea, but I prefer the light background. I think it's just easier for me to see the color against it in the contrast. But so that's a way you can create your own palette. As long as you're just going to be sitting on the table. I wouldn't hold it in your hand. If you're doing an easel painting, that could be dangerous, because it just could break while you're holding it, I guess, or you could drop it or something like that. Freezer paper is another option, and this was just left over from, like, you know, the grandparents' estate. So it's waxy on one side and paper on the other, just like the palette paper. So that works really good as well. And then if you don't have any of that, you can use, you know, even just some wax paper or some foil you can wrap around, or plastic wrap you can wrap around a clipboard or something like that. And of course there's the throwaways, but I like the idea of the reusable as much as possible. And then what I do with my old t-shirts, I take a tissue box, and then I just cut up an old t-shirt into pieces, and I just throw them in here. And so this is sort of my rag box. And I could even paint this with acrylic and make a really cool designer rag box if I wanted to. And I could seal it with varnish and make it, you know, like a permanent thing. Or you could use also an old baby wipe container as well. Thank you everyone for joining me for another episode of Healing Art After Hours. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you find this content helpful. And as always, happy creating. Bye.